Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast about foreign policy and world affairs. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. And in this show, we discuss topical global issues, have conversations with foreign affairs thought leaders and newsmakers, and give you the context you need to understand the world today. Go to globaldispatchespodcast.com to learn more. And now on with the show. Some truly remarkable events are unfolding in Sudan, where protesters have secured the ouster of longtime ruler Omar al Bashir. After nearly 30 years as an authoritarian president and dictator, he was deposed in a coup on April 11th. But the protesters have not dispersed and are rallying against the cadre of military officials who have assumed control. On the line with me to discuss these events in Sudan, including how we got to this moment and where the political upheaval may be heading, is Peyton Knopf. He is a former U.S. diplomat and UN official who has worked on Sudan issues for many years. He's currently an advisor to the U.S. Institute for Peace. We kick off discussing the events that led to the ouster of al-Bashir, but we don't dwell on that too much because I actually did an episode on that very topic as these protests first began in late December. I'll post a link to that episode on globaldispatchespodcast.com. Rather, we spend the bulk of the conversation discussing this unfolding and fluid situation. Peyton Knopf explains who these military rulers of Sudan are and why it's significant that some of them have trained and deployed militias to Yemen and Libya. We also discuss the implications of an International Criminal Court arrest warrant for al-Bashir and how the unfolding geopolitical dynamic may strongly influence how this political crisis is resolved. This is a very timely conversation, obviously. Also, I just want to emphasize how profound it is that these peaceful protests led to the ouster of Omar al Bashir. I have been covering Sudan issues, UN and U.S. policy towards Sudan for well over 15 years. And the fact that peaceful protesters were able to secure the ouster of this genocidal dictator is just sort of mind-boggling to me still, over a week after the fact. Before we start, I have a question for you all. One dynamic that I've noticed having done this show for so long is how I, as a journalist, often bring you stories from parts of the world less covered by mainstream outlets or on topics that are globally important but really don't get much coverage, certainly not the coverage they deserve. But then here's the interesting thing. You, as a listener, have taken some concrete real-world action based on what you've heard. This action could be something as direct as buying the book of an author I interviewed or using your professional connections to follow up on an idea or issue raised on the podcast. I hear stories of this real-world impact from time to time, but I would really love to collect them. So could you please email me and let me know if an episode inspired you to take some real-world action, whatever that may be. These stories of impact are very valuable to me, so thank you in advance. You can send me an email using the contact button on globaldispatchespodcast.com. I'll also post a link to my email in the description field of the podcast if you're listening on your phone. Thank you in advance for sharing your stories of how this podcast has impacted you and the actions that you've decided to take based on something that you heard on the podcast. All right, now here is my conversation with Peyton Knopf, an advisor to the United States Institute of Peace. I was sort of thinking about how long I've known you sort of professionally, and it must have been, I must have first come across you and your name in 2006 when you were a advisor or working with the U.S. envoy to Sudan.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
I mean, can you imagine this moment right now with Bashir stepping down and being deposed the way he was?
On the one hand, no, because of course just given the length of, his sort of longevity and staying power and the longevity and staying power of many of those around him. No, certainly in 2006, I don't think there was no sense that the country was going to be on the cusp of change, 10 or a little more years later, at least in this regard, right? I mean, the focus was obviously on the implementation of the peace agreement between Sudan and South Sudan. And that was largely predicated on some, sense that there was going to be, certainly after John Garang, a longtime South Sudanese independence leader, had died, predicated on more or less, the NCP and Bashir remaining.
NCP is the National Congress Party, we should say, which is Bashir's ruling base. Yeah.
Correct. Because there wasn't, as I said, after John Garang passed away, who had a vision for a new Sudan, not just for South Sudan's independence. There wasn't really a charismatic alternative in the country to Bashir and to his sort of inner circle. Having said that, I think by and large, and this persists to this day, and I was a U.S. diplomat in Khartoum, as you said, I don't think we've been particularly good as a government in really understanding the internal workings of the NCP and the different sort of party factions, never mind the broader Sudanese elite. So I think to some extent, even now, right? I mean, even post-Arab Spring, obviously, when you've seen change in a number of the surrounding countries, when you've seen a reshifting geopolitical landscape in the broader region, I think we were still, as a government, and even, those of us watching from the outside, quite surprised, when these protests broke out in December, right? And in some ways caught off guard, even though, in retrospect, I mean, looking back even 6 months, a lot of the kind of warning signs, if you want to call it that, were there. But look, Mark, I mean, you look at sort of the state of U.S. policy going into this really pivotal moment, and it was largely, it's been an effort toward driving towards normalization, again, focused on, essentially Bashir and his regime remaining in power. So it's been, I think not for the first time, U.S. policy has struggled to keep pace with events.
Yeah, I mean, it's to me as sort of a casual, not I guess more than a casual observer, I've reported a lot on U.S. policy towards Sudan, back in 2006 while you were sort of working that policy directly. But yeah, I mean, when these protests erupted in December, I mean, it caught my attention. I did a whole episode about those protests and about the origin of the protests and kind of like a long history of Omar al Bashir and how he came to power. And I'd sort of refer people to that episode for some deeper background. But for the purposes of this conversation, I'd be interested in sort of kind of talking through like what's happening and how are you interpreting sort of what's happening in Khartoum right now. But before we get there, could you just do like a very sort of brief introduction for people who did not listen to that previous episode of what these protests are all about and who Omar al Bashir is, sort of a shorter version of how we got to this moment right now?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And I was remiss in not earlier thanking you for having me on today to discuss this. Look, the proximate cause of the protests when they broke out in December of last year was the depth and severity of the economic crisis in facing Sudan. And that's been true and gradually worsening, and the economic situation gradually deteriorating over the last couple of years, but it had really intensified in the preceding sort of 12 months. And so, what began as, protests at bread prices and other really, and quite literally bread and butter issues, quickly morphed into what a discussion about the state of governance in the country and quite clearly the crisis of legitimacy facing Bashir and the National Congress Party and the ruling elite and those who had been, basically since 1989, the fundamental decision makers in the security apparatus of the country, whether that was the military, whether it was the internal, external security services, or the various irregular militia that have sprung up and really proliferated even since, I was at the embassy in Khartoum, 2006, 2007, 2008, and multiplied throughout the country, but who operate at the behest and with the support of Bashir and others in the government. And so what you saw was this groundswell of popular frustration that traversed socioeconomic and tribal and ethnic divisions in the country and clearly, resulted in what looks like, Bashir having been deposed by the military and now two different iterations in the last, week or so of a military-led government.
So actually, that leads nicely into my next set of questions, which is, who are like these cast of characters that are sort of titularly the head of the Sudanese government at the moment?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting, and actually, I mean, your first question about, could I have anticipated, or did we anticipate then the sort of scope of this change? It's interesting because a lot of these figures who are leading this military council are figures who were very much present and influential when I was serving at the embassy there, right? Particularly in the context of what was then a very brutal, as all of your listeners will recall, conflict in Darfur, right? So the head of the current head of the military council, who he's the sort of second leader, came to lead the council on Friday, was the commander of land forces in Darfur during that period of genocide. The number two in the current military council, a general who's called Hemeti, was the commander of one of the large sort of Arab militia then that perpetrated a lot of the atrocities that we saw. There was another faction of Arab militia, the Janjaweed, as you'll recall, who were also involved in that. And as time went on, sort of post-genocide, what you saw evolving in the Darfur landscape was a competition between, very violent, brutal competition, in fact, between rival Arab militia, and Hemeti was what essentially prevailed in that competition. So on the one hand, Mark, you do obviously see a very dynamic, fluid, and changing situation. On the other hand, the folks who, at least for the moment, seem to be in charge are not new, sort of progressive figures, right? And certainly what we've seen, even though the demonstrators and the sort of opposition coalition has constituted a negotiating body to engage with this military-led government, you haven't seen the sort of transformative change towards democracy, towards good governance, et cetera, that would be more consistent with the aspirations of the protesters that they've articulated over the last 4 months.
Well, yeah, and what's so interesting to me is that the protesters, they're not sort of taking like Bashir light for a plausible alternative. They rejected the first general, and now they seem to be in the process of drawing a really sort of hard line against this new general in charge. They really seem to be generally opposing military rule, which is just sort of like an interesting stance for them to take. And it seems the protesters right now feel extremely empowered.
I think that's right. And I think it's actually quite remarkable, not just what the demonstrators have been able to accomplish, right, in terms of organization and the protests themselves and sustaining them and building momentum behind them. But what you're also seeing is, I think, a extremely laudable kind of political maturity in the demonstrators. And, for example, a real caution about rushing to elections, right? I mean, as you just said, I think they've been very clear that a military-led government is not what they were looking for, and very clear that it's not going to meet the aspirations of the Sudanese people, but also importantly, not likely to be able to deal with the fundamental questions, issues of governance and the economy that, again, were the inspiration for the protests at the outset. But they're also, I think, being very strategic in not rushing towards elections and pushing for things that could actually lead to further instability and insecurity. Some of the experiences from elsewhere in the region, Libya, Syria, elsewhere, are cautionary tales, right? And I think the demonstrators and the leaders of this opposition, the Forces for Change, this opposition coalition, have really tried to think through how do you bridge to a moment that keeps the country intact, preserves the territorial integrity of Sudan and to some extent the functioning of the state, but also balance that obviously with the need for some really significant reforms. And what we're not seeing is yet the military government, at least not seeing from the outside, them willing to engage in that, on that basis.
So can I ask, what role do you see, or is the looming ICC arrest warrant over Omar al Bashir and presumably some of these other cast of characters in the military is having over this situation? I mean, as we're speaking right now, the latest report I saw from Khartoum suggested that Bashir had been moved from, house arrest in his, palace to a rather notorious prison in Khartoum, which suggests to me that the, ruling cadre right now see no role for him in any political transition. So what, I guess, do you think he might be sort of extradited somehow to The Hague? Or in general, how do you see the ICC sort of affecting the politics of what's happening right now in Sudan?
Yeah, I think it's an important question. I mean, I think I tend to try to err on the side of humility in terms of being able to predict, develop with 100% accuracy political developments in Sudan. I think one of the questions, even beyond the ICC, is, and I mean, we've seen not just Bashir, but a number of senior regime figures ostensibly removed from power, right? So Salah Ghosh, the longtime intelligence chief, was theoretically fired and replaced over the weekend. But I think the question remains about, while there may be the perception that some of these folks are included are certainly down, are they really out? And what is there? And do they have, is it true that they actually don't have any ability to influence the situation in the country? I'm not sure that's clear to us yet, right? And I saw the same report that you just referenced in terms of Bashir being moved to prison. Maybe, maybe not, right? I think we'll have to keep a close eye on that. I mean, the forces for change in the country have made very clear that accountability for crimes in the country, including but not limited to Bashir, is one of their top priorities. Whether that becomes done by the ICC or somehow internally with Sudan, if indeed Bashir is that's the trajectory that he's on, I don't know. I mean, I think the question of the ICC was in some ways more urgent while he was still sort of in power, because what you saw was this debate about, not wanting, if there was a negotiated path out for him, there was a tension between, particularly in the international community, in the West in particular, about whether to try to create that pathway, knowing that it may actually lead to him not being tried by the ICC, and what that would mean, what signals that would send more broadly in terms of impunity and sort of international justice. That question, I think, is a little less acute now, particularly if he's being sent to Kobar prison, as you said. But again, I just think we have to be very cautious, because the situation, is really quite fluid, and it's not 100% clear to me that all these figures, Bashir included, are completely without agency still. So, so I think we just have to sort of watch that situation.
So another sort of set of questions in another area I wanted to ask you about is how this unfolding political drama in Khartoum might affect like the kind of low level ongoing conflicts elsewhere in Sudan, like in the Kordofan region and the Blue Nile region. And this is an area, I should say, that is on the Sudanese border with South Sudan, that has often been the site of like a insurgency and brutal counterinsurgency by the government of Sudan, and is also an area of immense humanitarian suffering. How do you expect, or what do you think these events in Khartoum might imply for what's going on in some of those lower level conflicts that are still burning?
I think there's really two aspects to watch. One is what the military council, if it remains in power, which is obviously a big question, how it decides to deal with what is referred to by the Sudan watchers as the peripheral areas, right? So the southern Kordofan, Blue Nile, as you said, but also Darfur and kind of the areas furthest away from Khartoum. And one of the forces for change in the country have made very clear that one of their priorities is ending the internal conflicts in Sudan. I think, given what we were talking about earlier, that a lot of the folks who are still in this military council have been involved in these conflicts in the past. I think it's hard to see the military government making a good faith effort to address the local grievances that have led to these conflicts, sort of dragging on for some decades now, without any sincere political engagement from the center in terms of resolving them. So that's one thing to watch. I think the second thing is that you've seen two different sort of groupings of opposition now, right? I mean, the demonstrators and the folks that really have been on the vanguard of the changes that we've seen in the last couple of weeks are in some ways different than the kind of old guard opposition who, particularly from Southern Kordofan and Blue Nile, have been the main interlocutors in a ongoing set of negotiations under the auspices of the African Union between Khartoum and Southern Kordofan and Blue Nile. And there are divides within that sort of old guard opposition that have complicated matters, particularly in Southern Kordofan in the last couple of years. And that's also, I hate to keep sort of using the word fluid, but what has happened in Khartoum really since December has shaken up that kind of geometry. And so it's still, the dust really has not settled in terms of how the different opposition figures as individuals and the different opposition movements in the two areas, both politically and the military movement on the ground, kind of, sort of react to this going forward. I mean, I think, many of the aspirations that we've seen in animating the demonstrations in the last couple of months, which I should say have not just been in Khartoum. They've been in areas throughout the country, which is speaks to, I think, why this has been and is proving to be the most significant threat to Bashir and the NCP's rule since they took power in 1989. Many of those same grievances, not all of them, are the same things that the people of Southern Kordofan and Blue Nile have been, fighting for some years now. So it's fighting against. So, I think that's, again, I mean, the politics is very unsettled, right? But it's hard for me to see a military government that's currently in power dealing in any meaningful way with resolving those internal conflicts.
So that military government currently in power seems to have the support of Saudi Arabia and UAE, not least for the fact that some Sudanese militias and forces have fought on the ground in Yemen on behalf of Saudi Arabia and the UAE. On the other side of things, it seems that the so-called Troika, which is the United States, the United Kingdom, and Norway, right? Norway is the other one?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Norway. Okay. Have issued statements supporting the aspirations of the protesters. So it seems that you're having like a really interesting international sort of relations dynamic unfolding right now. What should we be looking out for there? What can you sort of tell us about sort of the various like foreign policies towards Sudan as they're unfolding?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the most worrisome sort of issues, from my perspective at least, is the kind of the vacuum in the geopolitics, right, and how disruptive this has been and can potentially even be more disruptive to what is already a very, very volatile region. I mean, Sudan, Mark, as you know, sits at a strategic crossroads between North Africa, the Sahel, and the Middle East. And, there's a country with twice the population of Syria. So, in this very fluid inflection point, it's, the sort of regional politics and rivalries are very concerning. And it's potentially very damaging, not just to the transition, but to the integrity and functioning of the state. If a lot of the divisions that we've seen in Libya, for example, among some of the Gulf states, in Yemen and elsewhere, begin to play out in the Sudan context. I mean, we talked about earlier this gentleman Hamedi, who's the number 2 in the military council. He is, and it's important, I think, for listeners to understand this. He is the commander of the militia that has deployed into Yemen on behalf of Sudan as part of the Saudi-led coalition. So when you just said earlier that it appears as if the military council has the support of the UAE and Saudi Arabia, that's exactly right. The Saudis and the Emiratis have issued statements of support. They've offered financial assistance, if not other forms of assistance potentially. And in some ways, that shouldn't be surprising, given that the fact that I think it was yesterday morning, Hameti announced that the military council had taken the decision to leave the Sudanese troops in Yemen, among other factors. Right now, I think one of the things that we have to watch is whether, for example, Qatar or Turkey, both of whom have been deeply engaged in Sudan for a number of years. Qatar was involved in the mediation process for Darfur for several years. Turkey, as recently as last year, signed a long-term lease for a small island off the coast of Sudan in the Red Sea, which Qatar swiftly announced it would spend several $billion investing in. So these countries have deep engagements, and certainly given the crisis within the GCC,
that's the Gulf Cooperation Council. You're referring to the sort of the divisions between Qatar and UAE in Saudi Arabia. Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
And so you see these camps, the Saudis, the Emiratis on one side, not to oversimplify, the Qataris and the Turks on the other, all of whom have very legitimate security interests in Sudan, unquestionably. But it's the rivalry coming into this, this really volatile moment inside South Sudan that I think we have to be quite concerned about. And just to add on the West and sort of its role, you have seen some clear statements, if not belatedly, from the United States and its partners, welcoming the aspirations of the demonstrators, etc. I think what we're still waiting to see, Mark, is that the day before yesterday, the African Union issued what was frankly the most forceful international statement yet with respect to the military council, essentially saying that the African Union would suspend Sudan's membership in the AU if the military council does not hand over to a civilian-led government in the next 15 days. We've seen the European Union, to its great credit, endorse that timeline. What we still haven't seen is the U.S. Voice its explicit support for that. And so in some ways, the African Union is leaning, not in some ways, in all ways, the African Union is leaning really far forward and emphasizing one of the core demands of the demonstrators, namely a civilian-led transition on a strict timeline. And, it's a little unclear where the West is on that. Equally unclear is what messages Washington in particular, but also some of our European partners and allies are conveying to the states in the Middle East with respect to the very concerns that I just spoke about.
So it would be your perspective that a policy, international policy, the policy of the United States, of Europe to ensure the quick transition to civilian role is like the optimal policy option and policy preference right now, and what the U.S. and others should be pressing for.
No question. I mean, I think, look, we all have an interest. I mean, we, meaning the West, the Sudan's neighbors, the states in the broader Middle East, have an interest in stability and the functioning of Sudan. I think the only way of reaching that sort of stable outcome at this point is, in fact, for civilian-led transition. The notion that everybody sort of can line up behind this very in some ways, kind of seemingly fluid mix of military leaders who kind of come in and shuffle the deck chairs, and that's a recipe for stability, I think is very misplaced. And so we absolutely do have to line up in support of a civilian-led transition as swiftly as possible. And, appreciating, again, as I said earlier, that I think one of the most remarkable things about these demonstrations is a real political maturity and a desire to think through then how you start putting the country on a new path that is not just stable, but is democratic and meeting the aspirations of the people of Sudan. I mean, what you don't see, Mark, to the credit of the demonstrators, are these calls for sort of the dismantling of the state's institutions or a wholesale cleaning, or purge. And I think that's very, very encouraging and merits the support of the international community consistently and vocally.
So finally, what events or ideas or things, for lack of a better word, will you be looking out for in the next few days, weeks, and months that might suggest to you one way or another how this event, this political event, will play out?
Well, I think one thing to watch and keep a close eye on, as we were talking about earlier, was how a number of the states from the Middle East engage on this question. And look, I mean, as events unfold in Sudan, right, we're seeing a very dynamic situation in Libya, a very fluid situation in Algeria. You have a in some ways quite fragile, although potentially promising, political transition in Ethiopia, just to the southeast of Sudan, a country of over 100 million people that has never undergone a democratic or frankly nonviolent transition in its history, and now is just in the first year of a new prime minister. So there's a lot at stake in this region right now, and so I think one thing to keep a close eye on is how all these different sort of pieces interact with one another. I think the second thing I would look at, and not unrelated, is this issue of the internal conflicts in Sudan and whether they potentially flare up. Southern Kordofan and Blue Nile are very important to watch, as you rightly brought up. But I think Darfur is also at a really critical moment. There's been as you followed for a long time, there's been one of the largest UN peacekeeping missions in the world in Darfur. And a process was begun long before these protests to reduce and ultimately end that UN mission in Darfur. What you're seeing, though, Mark, is that not just the presence of senior figures in the military council who have been engaged in the conflict in Darfur in a command role for some years, but you're also seeing a link between Darfur and what's happening in Libya, in that a number of the Darfuri militias that opposed Bashir's government and the government in Khartoum have been for some time now fighting in Libya on behalf of General Haftar, who, as your readers your listeners, will know, is in the process of trying to having asserted his dominance in the southern part of Libya. He's pushing towards Tripoli, and
as we speak, there's like a battle in Tripoli ongoing, and
exactly. Yeah. Now, what you've got then is the Darfuri militia supporting the military council have, of course, deployed to Khartoum to support that, right, and on to Yemen, as we were talking about earlier. So one of the other questions is, do you see some of the Darfuri forces fighting with Haftar now seeing an opportunity to come back to Darfur and assert some of their dominance? So, it's those kinds of issues that are sort of they're kind of transnational in some ways that I think we have to keep a really, really close eye on.
I mean, this could really, just hearing you describe this, I mean, this could really go either way. I mean, this could turn into a Libya, or it could turn into, a Tunisia.
Absolutely. I mean, look, we're seeing the most significant changes in North and Northeast Africa in a generation, all more or less unfolding in parallel. And that would be a challenge under any circumstances, right? But given everything else that's going on in the world, it's a particularly acute challenge, I think, for Western policymakers and others. I mean, policymakers in the Middle Eastern states we're talking about, who are wrestling with, still with Syria, still with Yemen, never mind things, further afield. And so, the risks are huge. The implications are great for, far beyond just Sudan or just Libya, right? I mean, these are big questions of international peace and security, and how this plays out in these various countries over the next, frankly, even 6 months. It could be as soon as that. The people of the region, most importantly, but folks around the world are going to have to live with those consequences for years to come.
Well, Peyton Knopf, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much for having me, Mark. It was a great conversation. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Peyton. That was extremely helpful to me as I sort of figure out how to understand issues as they unfold in the coming weeks and months. And again, thank you all in advance for emailing me your stories about how this podcast has inspired you to take some real world action one way or another. As I said, these are very valuable to me for several reasons. Number one, I do what I do because I, want to make an impact on the world. And these stories are really good ways for me to measure the kind of impact that this show is having. So thank you in advance for emailing me. I will see you next time. Bye.